Oscar Micheaux is not only one of the earliest African American filmmakers, but also one of the earliest filmmakers, exploring the relatively untapped medium of film, starting with his first film, The Homesteader, in 1919. Unlike his white colleagues who were coming to fame with genres such as horror, comedy, or sci-fi, Micheaux focused on the African American experience during the pivotal artistic movement of the Harlem Renaissance. Perhaps the most apt comparisons to modern film would be people like Spike Lee or Melvin Van Peebles, both of whom operated in film around a half a century later. Micheaux often followed the philosophies of Booker T. Washington, who was a prominent black figure a short time before Micheaux would start creating his works within film. This meant Micheaux's philosophies was mostly that of self-help. He preached that African Americans should lift themselves up, educate themselves, and create an ecosystem in which African Americans buy African American products, creating a self-sustainable community. Even at the time, this was seen as somewhat of a controversial take and led to Micheaux having to use profits from his films to self-fund new projects, effectively also making Micheaux one of the first independent filmmakers. This would unfortunately lead to Micheaux bankrupting himself, which is a major reason why he stopped making films later in life. There are really two other major reasons Micheaux was ostracized by the African American community, and those were his views on class as well as religion within the community. Micheaux was really suspicious of African American preachers, thinking that they were often in the pockets of white oppressors, and that preachers viewed things like being educated as impure, thus having held down the African American community they would serve. This is evident both within Our Gates and Body of Soul, the former of which has a character of Old Ned who takes donations from other whites and essentially sells out in order to earn pennies. The character himself is very self-loathing, saying in the film, "Again I've sold my birthright, all for a miserable mess of pottage. African Americans and white, all are equal. As for me, miserable sinner, hell is my destiny." This anecdote directly mirrors what we see our main character Sylvia doing in trying to save an African American school through collecting donations from white people, which I think is a very potent message to send to the audience and kind of creates a double meaning to the story. In Body and Soul, the whole film is about the idea of faith being used to negatively impact someone, with Martha, one of our main characters, having her fortune stolen by her daughter Isabel. Martha hid the money in the Bible and reasons that since it's a holy place, no one would steal it. After her daughter steals the money, Martha's faith is tested, and this was clearly a story Micheaux has a lot of belief in, as he himself was cheated out of money and property by his preacher father-in-law. Perhaps this is where the mistrust of religion began, and it really wasn't the most popular take at the time. It is interesting though. It isn't an uncommon theme these days to have a film about the distrust of religious belief. But back then, Micheaux was really a pioneer in the genre, and Body and Soul is perhaps Micheaux's most interesting film about this. As I stated earlier, another controversial part of Micheaux's career was his views on the middle class, which he pretty much found himself a part of. In Micheaux's films, the middle class is usually portrayed as the most well-rounded, with lower class people often being seen as beggars and crooks, and the higher class being seen as being corrupted by money. The perfect medium, Micheaux reasoned, was the middle class, which a lot of the more pure characters in his films were characterized as being. This is unfortunate given at the time and even to this day, African Americans are much more likely to be poor than most, due to the unfortunate economic systems that were and are in place. And this often seems counterintuitive to the overall message of the African American people lifting themselves out of debt and poverty, often placing the blame on African Americans for not doing it themselves like he managed to do. On a more positive note, Micheaux did expose viewers to the everyday lives of African Americans. For example, in Murder in Harlem, one of Micheaux's relatively few talking films, we see a black man who is blamed for the death of a white woman who was murdered and who the man just happened upon while doing his job. This is a strong commentary on law for the time, especially when coming from an African American, as most films of the day really glorified the idea of police and rarely questioned the law in general, as Micheaux does here. Henry in the film is also a refreshingly strong African American character in the film, having educated himself and become a novelist and lawyer, who, while people question his skills, still comes to prove himself by the end of the film. Micheaux was one of the first major black filmmakers and inspired many future filmmakers of all races, including two of the most popular African American filmmakers, Melvin Van Peebles and Spike Lee, as I mentioned earlier. Sadly, Micheaux would die in 1951, mostly forgotten. However, in recent years, film and art communities are starting to rediscover Micheaux over the past couple decades. And while the peak of his artistic practice was very clearly his work during the silent era, I found Murder in Harlem to be a fun early mystery film with some good merit. It was somewhat of a rare feat to see a director translate from silent to talking films with such grace, so it was a fun surprise to see Murder in Harlem and enjoy the film as much as I did. By the end of his life, he made a very respectable library of films, with around 30 total, though we don't know for sure as most of them are lost. However, we still do have around 13 films with a lot of really interesting concepts that forced audiences to confront the often unfortunate circumstances of African American life in the early part of the 20th century.